Today we have some super fun adventures waiting for you. Will it be the magical color-changing slime? Or how about the craziest, stretchiest slimes ever? Have fun, and don't forget to hit the like button if you love slime.
In May 1951, a strange incident is said to have taken place in the city of Manila in the Philippines. One night, a police officer was on patrol when he came across an 18-year-old girl stumbling through the back streets. She was clothed in a flimsy dress and seemed to be talking to herself. He overheard her saying, "Help me! Help me! Someone is biting me!" The police officer suspected that she was high on drugs and suffering from hallucinations, so he arrested her and brought her down to the police station. However, when he took off her handcuffs at the station and tried to take her fingerprints, the girl suddenly started screaming. "He's here! He's here! Help me! He's chasing me!" she cried, before collapsing to the floor. As the policeman bent down to help her up, he saw something that horrified him. Right before his very eyes, fresh bite marks began to appear on the girl's shoulders and arms. The wounds were deep and started bleeding. The police officer couldn't believe what he was seeing and immediately contacted the chief of police. His boss was furious about being disturbed in the middle of the night. He got out of bed and came down to the station to see what was wrong. At first, he thought the girl must have made the marks herself, but when he examined her more closely, he realized that the bite marks were in places she couldn't possibly reach. "You can't chew on your own back," he muttered, scratching his head. They decided to keep the girl in the police station overnight and locked her in a cell. During the night, a police officer was tasked of watching over her and making sure she didn't hurt herself while in police custody. As dawn arrived, the girl was sleeping peacefully, so the policeman decided to take a break for a cup of coffee. Just as he was pouring himself a cup, he heard the girl screaming again. "He's back! He's back!" Her cries were blood-curdling, and the police officer was so surprised that he dropped his coffee. The cup smashed on the floor, and he struggled to find his keys in his pocket. As he listened to the terrifying shrieks coming from the direction of the cells, he was sure that the girl was in fear for her life. By the time the police officer managed to unlock the door to the cells, the screaming had stopped. He found the girl lying on the floor of her cell in a pool of blood. Her throat had been torn out, and there were bite marks all over the back of her neck. The police chief arrived at the station with the coroner, and both men examined the girl's corpse. Neither of them could explain how she had been murdered while locked in an empty cell. Every policeman in the station was trembling with fear. According to the legend, the police covered up the strange incident, dismissing it as a voluntary departure from life. When I was a child, my parents lived in an old apartment building that was 14 stories high. Like many buildings, it was built without a 13th floor. It went straight from the 12th floor to the 14th floor. However, the elevators still had a 13th button, even though it didn't work. There were two other kids, Terry and June, who were living in the building. We were the same age, we went to the same school, and the three of us often played together in the evenings. One day, while we were waiting for our parents to come home, we decided to explore the roof of the apartment building. We took the elevator to the 14th floor where we found the door to access the roof. After a while, we grew bored and went back downstairs in the elevator. When we were halfway down, Juness realized that she had forgotten something. She left her coat on the roof. She hit the stop button, then pressed the button for the 14th floor. Suddenly, the elevator ground to a halt and beeped 3 times. The door slid open and we realized we were stuck between floors. Terry was about to slide out through the opening when I grabbed him and held him back. I told him it was too dangerous. If the elevator started up again while we were getting out, we could be sliced in half. Instead, I jabbed at the emergency button. The elevator groaned again and the doors slowly slid shut with a clang. "What's going on?" asked Terry. I shook my head and replied, "I don't know." As we stood there shivering, the lights in the elevator suddenly went off and we were plunged into darkness. Then, one of the buttons on the panel lit up. It was the button for the 13th floor. None of us had pressed that button. It simply lit up by itself. It wasn't supposed to be able to light up. There was no 13th floor. To our complete and utter horror, we felt the elevator slowly move upwards. June jabbed the stop button, but it didn't work. We watched as the floors passed by. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. There was a sound of scraping metal and the elevator ground to a halt. The doors slid open and we were staring into pitch darkness. All 3 of us huddled together in the elevator, too petrified to move. Just then, we heard a faint noise in the murky blackness. It made our hair stand on end. Squelch! Squelch! It was a wet and sticky noise, the kind of noise you get when you throw a wet cloth against the wall. Squelch! Squelch! It sounded like something soggy dragging itself across the floor. As we strained our ears to listen, trembling in fear, the sounds grew faster, gathering pace. Squelch! Squelch! There was a sickly, moldy smell in the air. It was like the stench of rotting meat. The sounds picked up pace, getting faster and faster. Squelch! Squelch! Just when it sounded like it was almost upon us, the elevator suddenly sprang to life. The doors began to close. The stench of death and decay was unbearable. As soon as the elevator doors shut with a clang, something smashed into them with a wet slap. The elevator creaked and began to go down. When the doors finally opened, we found ourselves on the ground floor. My father was standing there. When I saw him, I jumped up and embraced him. I still wonder what would have happened if he hadn't pressed the button to call the elevator at that exact moment. When I was a little girl, my father's job meant that our family had to move around a lot. I don't remember most of the small towns we lived in, since we were only there for a few weeks. But one small town was burned into my memory forever. My parents rented an old, dilapidated house there for a few months. The house was in a bad state of repair and only one bathroom had running water. Unfortunately, the bathroom was on the top floor of the house, right next to the attic. I always hated that bathroom. It gave me the creeps. There was a little door in the wall of the bathroom that gave access to the attic. The room was always freezing cold, even though it was the middle of summer. One night, I was taking a bath before bedtime. I happened to glance up at the little door in the wall of the bathroom. The door had always been locked and there was no key, so we had never gone into the attic. Curiosity got the better of me and I decided to investigate. I stepped out of the bath and looked through the keyhole. I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black inside the attic. I put my ear to the door and listened. There was a faint scratching sound. When I put my eye up to the keyhole again, I saw something moving in the darkness. I jumped back in surprise, and the next moment, the sharp end of a screwdriver poked through the keyhole, thrusting back and forth, stabbing at thin air as if in a frenzy. Then it disappeared back through the keyhole. It almost poked my eye out. I screamed in horror and ran out of the bathroom, stark naked and dripping wet. When I got downstairs, I cried out for my parents. "Mom! Dad! Come quick! There's someone in the attic!" I yelled. My parents calmed me down and I told them what had happened. They didn't believe me, but just to be sure, my dad agreed to check out the attic. He grabbed a hammer and a flashlight and bounded up the stairs, followed closely by myself and my mother. The little door in the bathroom was locked and there was no key, so my father pried the hinges off the door using his hammer. When he shone the flashlight inside, the attic was completely empty. My parents dismissed it as just my childish imagination, and a few weeks later, we left the house and moved to a different town. Still, I never could forget the horrific incident that had happened in that old house, and it was a long time before I could ever feel safe while taking a bath. Years later, I was in the area and decided to visit the old house where I had spent a brief part of my childhood. I reconnected with an old friend on Facebook. I had known him as a child and arranged to meet him again. We went for a walk around the town and shared our memories of the old place. When we were passing by the old house, I told him that I had lived there with my parents for a few months. "Yeah, the screwdriver house," he chuckled. My blood ran cold. I had never told anyone else about what had happened to me in the bathroom all those years ago. "Why do you call it that?" I stammered. "That's what everyone calls it," he replied casually. "You didn't hear the stories?" "No, tell me," I said in a weak voice. My stomach felt as if it was tied in knots. "Shortly after it was built, a family moved in. A husband, his wife, and their 4 beautiful daughters," he said. "His wife died, and I guess you could say he went a little screwy. Nobody knows why, but the man murdered all 4 of his daughters with a screwdriver and stacked their bloody corpses in the attic." When I was in elementary school, my father would often take me hiking in the mountains. One night, we had stayed out too long, and it began to grow dark. A thick fog drifted over the hillside, and we could barely see the path in front of us. My father was holding my hand to make sure I didn't fall. As we made our way down the slope, I noticed a small, shadowy figure appearing out of the mist on the path up ahead. My father suddenly squeezed my hand very tightly. "Ow, Dad! That hurts!" I cried. My father looked down at me. His face was grim. "Close your eyes," he barked, "and don't open them again until I say so." His tone of voice was so stern that I did as I was told without questioning it. He kept a tight grip on my hand, and with my eyes tightly shut, I stumbled along beside him through the fog. When we passed the spot where the shadowy figure had been, I heard a small voice muttering, "Die, die, 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 die." The rest of the way down, my father was silent, and it wasn't until we got back home that he finally allowed me to open my eyes. Since that time, he refused to speak about the incident. 20 years later, I paid my father a visit. He was drinking some alcohol and we were having a heart-to-heart conversation. Something reminded me of the strange incident on the mountain path, and I decided to ask him about it. "Remember that small, shadowy figure in the fog?" I said. "Who was it?" My father was silent for a quite while, and eventually, in a low voice, he replied, "It was you." With that, he refilled his glass and refused to discuss it any further.